Well, here we are at the beginning of the saga. I've spent a great deal of time thinking about where to go with this. So tonight on this first episode, I am just going to talk. I have no script, I have nothing prepared. I just want to set the table tonight for my initial thoughts and maybe give you guys a bit of an idea about where we're going with this. So, I think it's important to say that networking and the theory of networking is more than bits and bytes. When you dive deep down into networking, you get lost in the technical minutia. But just like all of information theory, networking, which is a small component therein, is a study of relationships. And those relationships can be between computers, which is my specialty, routers, switches, ROADMs, all the things we're going to spend many, many hours talking about on this podcast. But it can also be the relationships between people, between different elements of society, between different societies in general. So when we're talking about networking, unless we're down in the deep, dark recesses of talking about how bits go across a wire, if you take a step back, we're actually talking about how people communicate. And I know that might sound a bit grandiose, but the theories that are used for how to route packets on a network have also been used to trace the viral ideas travel through a population, be that a rumor or the latest Kardashian TikTok. These things have a methodology and a structure to them. And once you see it, there's a certain amount of beauty in it and also a certain amount of terror. Because what you realize is that people inherently communicate. And whether or not that communication is accurate is fundamentally irrelevant. So, what I want to convey in this is that networking in terms of the internet is the story of an idealized means of communication. However, it is flawed by the very people who came up with it, us, human beings. So when we get into this story, as we're going to start tonight, I hope to be able to draw out some of those inadequacies in myself, in the history of networking, in the history of math and science, not to cast doubt, but to show how science and engineering has spent hundreds of years trying to strive to be better than our base human nature. To look at things and determine their truth and their cause without being subject to our own predilections. So I wanted to throw that out to you because what we're going to talk about in these first few episodes are the pieces I was missing. So I started my career after almost failing out of high school and ending up in the Navy. It didn't work. Shocking, right? But when I left the Navy, I got a job as a second shift network operations person. So, and the only reason I'm mentioning this is because that means I didn't have a formal education in this. I didn't have that intro to computer science class that others had. When I was a kid, there were no classes on networking. There were like 5 guys who went to a hotel bar every year to figure out what was going on, right? Um, so if it seems like in these first few episodes, I'm taking you down some odd paths, just understand I'm trying to share those pieces that finally clicked for me over the course of my career that helped me move past the lack of education. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I'd like to start. Uh, well, look, let me be honest, right? This history starts with the first written word back in Babylon, what, 4 or 5,000 BC? I don't know the actual date off the top of my head. But that would be ridiculous to try and trace all the way back to that. Just know that from then to the Greeks, to the Romans, to Gutenberg, all of this is the story of networking because it's all about how people communicate. However, it's not that interesting in terms of network communications. So where we're actually going to start is with a gentleman named Euler. Now, in the 1300s, he was one of those key mathematicians. And as I said, I'm not formally trained, so I would encourage, if after this you want to go look more in depth than anyone I mentioned, please do. And what Euler did was kind of amazing. Along with all the other work he did, he was kind of the first mathematician that looked at puzzles and realized that these were just math problems in a different format. So there's this famous problem that for a long time was unsolved, and it became a bit of a piece of the culture of the city called Königsberg in Prussia, and it's the 7 bridges of Königsberg. I'll flash a map up here to show you what I'm talking about, but the people of Königsberg who didn't have the internet or the Kardashians, they enjoyed kind of giving each other puzzles, right? Whether it was word puzzles, pun games, whatever. This was a common way to relax a little bit before all of our modern world came about. And one of the puzzles in Königsberg was, is it possible to cross each bridge only once and still manage to cross all of the bridges? Okay, so this is effectively like a maze. There was a river running through the city with 2 islands in the river. There were bridges between the islands and the shore, and there was a bridge between the 2 islands. And the logic game here was, can you construct a path that gets you across all of the bridges in the city, but never repeat one? And no one had ever done it. It turns out it's not possible. But Euler looked at this and thought, I wonder if we can apply mathematics to this. And he did. And this was kind of an aside from the main thrust of his work. It's actually it has more interest in our modern world than it ever has in the past, simply because of why we're talking about it. But what he proved was that it could not happen. And not only did he prove mathematically that it couldn't happen, he proved what it would take, what situation would have to exist for the problem as stated to be solvable. Okay, and once you do that, then it can be repeated very easily, right? Once someone has figured out a methodology for something, it becomes repeatable. And he did that. He figured this out. He told his friends about it. I don't know if he published it or he sent letters, but it's well documented. And it was one of those things in the era of mathematics where it was kind of a neat story. So it got spread around. And this was the birth of two branches of modern mathematics. The first and most obvious is it became the seed that grew into graph theory. And the second piece was the work with topologies. That's a bit more, that's a bit deeper and kind of out of my scope of knowledge. But both of these theories deal with math across a entity, whether it's a graph tree or the topology. And it's math of topologies. So he really kicked that off. It was really one of those moments, although it wouldn't bear, it would have impact, but it wouldn't bear fruition for hundreds of years to being kind of this key moment. So that starts us off in the 1300s. And this whole episode, by the way, I'm going to go through some of these moments in time to get us up to the start of a more linear story, really to give the scope and the background of networking. The next person we should probably talk about is Charles Babbage. He was this, we've jumped forward and I am skipping a lot. If anyone wants more detail on all these little, intricacies, let me know and we can start delving into that. But eventually we get to Charles Babbage and his work on the difference engine, which is sort of the first true computational device. I mean, there had been calculators before, but there hadn't been devices that could kind of do multi-stage or advanced mathematics. And Babbage was trying to make this device that could. And it was kind of seen as a toy at the time. And one of the inputs for this was the greatest fraud in the 18th and 19th century. It was the Turk, right? The chess playing robot, which actually turned out to be a very complex, hiding place for a small master chess player who was actually controlling the robot, right? This fraud, he played Napoleon, he played for 100 years, this thing was touring around randomly. And it was absolutely and completely a fraud. But Charles Babbage saw this and played it once and was absolutely fascinated by it. And that fed into this work he was doing on the difference engine. As an interesting aside, one of the people working to prove that this was a fraud was Edgar Allan Poe. Just saying, history's weird, man. All right. Now we're going to shelve Babbage for a moment. We're going to put him up here and just kind of leave him there for a second because we need to talk about Lord Byron. Everyone knows who Lord Byron is. If you don't, please go read everything he's ever written and read up on him. The whole group of them were just unreal. Okay. He gets married, which is ironic in the extreme for this man. And Byron has a daughter with his wife. Shortly thereafter, like in the span of weeks, maybe months, they get a divorce for like obvious reasons, right? This is Byron. He's not going to be married to one person for his whole life. So his ex-wife gives birth to a daughter. And she's terrified that her daughter is going to end up this flighty, kind of artsy thinker like Byron, who has no concept or responsibility and just kind of does whatever the heck he wants. Her mother is just terrified of that. So she raises her daughter in a very strict and structured way, and she happens to love math. She's in the modern vernacular, she would be kind of neurodivergent a little bit. Her daughter was not, but she was just fixated on mathematics. She thought mathematics was the way to live a good life, right? Everything just logical, regimented, numbers mean what numbers mean kind of stuff, right? And the more you worked with math, the less likely you were to be, in our vernacular, one of those dirty hippies, right? So Ada was raised in this way, and she was just an unabashed genius in her younger years. She actually met Babbage at a party when she was a teenager. She became quite into the socialite scene in London at the time. And they met, and it was this relatively older gentleman. He was in her 40s at the time, and she was a teenager. And they spent the whole party as this odd couple, almost like an island in a storm, because they stood there talking for hours. Babbage was telling her about the difference engine. She was asking just stunningly intelligent questions. And this formed a friendship that would kind of define definitely Babbage's life and a little bit Ada's life. Now, she goes off and gets married. And there's a whole bunch going on here that I'm skipping over and breezing over. But eventually, she and her husband become the Count and Countess of Lovelace. So, of course, we're talking about Ada Lovelace. And she had kids. She kind of not pulled back from Babbage, but didn't really have the time to focus on being his sounding board. But eventually, he sent a paper for her to review before it was published. And what she did was she wrote notes on this paper to give back to Babbage for him to consider before publishing that were actually longer than the paper itself. And in one of those notes, she played with an idea in her mind of how the difference engine could potentially be used to solve a complex problem by being told a series of steps to take to do so. Now, this was unheard of. And today, that is generally perceived as the very first representation of a computer program. So in that moment between Babbage and Ada Lovelace, the future was kind of formulated and solidified out of this nebulous, where are we going to take all this math? There's all these ideas about automation. What comes next? Well, in the mid-1800s, all of a sudden we had it. Now, off to the side, there were just a ton of other inventions going on, right? It was the miracle days. That's why steampunk is so popular. You had Morse and the telegraph. You had, shortly thereafter, you had Marconi with the radio. You had Tesla coming in. All of these have tie-ins to the modern internet. They're not too direct, though, so I don't want to waste a ton of time talking about them. Maybe at some point in the future, we can discuss these weird little kind of paths and turns, and how four different things grouped together to really give us the start we needed in the internet. For the moment, I would like to fast forward from the mid 1800s, and let's take a brief aside on the telegraph, because to me, the telegraph is the granddaddy of everything when it comes to our modern communication structure. When you combine the telegraph with the radio and the work Marconi and Tesla and everyone else were doing, that's it. That's where it all started. And interestingly, when we get into line coding and how we actually transmit information, the most fascinating part of that to me is that Morse code really defined that before they even knew what they were trying to do, right? They had to solve a similar problem, and they solved it just so elegantly that it's very nearly a precursor to a modern network connection. All right, so let's get to the 1930s, and we're right up against the kind of start of our official story, which will be post-World War II. In the 1930s, we had two people who just absolutely changed the world. I'm relatively sure you'll have all heard of one of them. And you even are probably shouting out right now, you know who it is, right? It's Turing, with his paper in 1936, where he laid out and he wasn't even trying to create computers, right? All of these are stories of people who were faced with a problem, try to solve that problem without knowing what comes next, right? This is the value of pure research. This is why we do it, because we don't know what benefits we'll get from knowledge. So knowledge, by definition, is a boundless source of benefit. And it's worth pursuing in and of itself. So his paper, he was trying to solve a particularly perplexing problem of the day. And it almost doesn't really matter what that problem is. I'll definitely do an episode each on these two gentlemen, so we'll get into the details. But just understand that the method he used to answer that question is the foundation. It built on what Ada did, and it took it to a whole nother level. Okay. Interestingly, that wasn't the end of Turing, right? Everyone's seen the movies. Everyone knows the stories about Bletchley Park. But there is one thing a lot of people don't know, which is his 1950 his paper in 1950 on computers and intelligence. How would you know if a computer is independently intelligent or not? What does intelligence mean? This was another absolutely seminal paper and is becoming more and more important with each passing day in our modern world. And his story is just so abysmally sad. But again, we'll do a full deep dive on that. The other person that we should talk about is Claude Shannon. Now, almost no one I talk to has ever heard of him. In fact, give me just a moment here. Yes, I know, but I told you I had a busy day at work and it was snowing here, so I had to shovel everything, so I didn't write a script. You're going to deal with what you get tonight, my friends. All right. So, this book, A Mind at Play, if you have any interest in modern communications of any sort, you need to understand who Claude Shannon is. He wrote a paper in 1937 when he was at MIT that, while Turing's paper of 36 was the seminal paper on how computation would work, what Claude did was define the language that we would use to do that. His work on binary representation and binary communication was absolutely the single most important step we took towards modern communication. Let me give you a bit of an example on this one. In the 1930s and 40s, and obviously we had a war going on, so no one's thinking long term. But as soon as the war ended, and I'm not sure exactly the date, but somehow, and again, I'll do a whole episode on this, Claude ended up at Bell Labs, a company, a piece of AT&T. And this is one of those, I inherently have an issue with the idea that corporations drive innovation. I think that is a partial truth. And this is one time when I will say that's part of the truth, because what the work that happened at Bell Labs was seminal. It was the group of people at Bell Labs who AT&T hired when they were a monopoly, and they basically just got them all in a building in New Jersey, the brightest minds that they could hire, and said, go think at things and see what you come up with. The only rule they had was that if a Bell engineer came to them and said, hey, I have a problem, the only rule was they had to listen to the engineer's problem, and then they had to spend time thinking about how it might be resolved. That's it. They didn't have revenue requirements. They didn't have anything. It was basically this: get these incredibly smart people together and see what they come up with. And Claude, along with others, right? He wasn't the only one, but his paper from 37 became the foundation that would solve the biggest problem of the era at that time, which was all communication in that day was basically a pair of copper wires. So when we talk about this a bit further, I'll drag some pictures out. But if you looked at these exchanges or these long distance phone routes, they were, some of them were a meter around bundle of those little twisted pair phone wires. And AT&T realized that there was no way this infrastructure would scale. There wasn't enough copper on the planet to fuel the need for more and more phone connections, more and more undersea cables, right? It was just, they were running up against a brick wall. And what the guys at Bell Labs did was, over the course of a very short period of time, they created the idea that, hey, we don't have to keep this phone call as an analog connection. If we make this phone call digital, again, going back to his prior work on digital communications, we can then combine a bunch of these analog calls, turn them into digital calls, and utilize a infrastructure to transmit those from end to end. This will allow us to group them together. Now, in the very beginning, we're not talking about a network as we think of it today. In the very beginning, what they were doing was, well, let's wrap this up by talking about, so a T1 is a piece of telephony. Well, it's a telephony circuit, okay? It's two pair. But on that two pair, you can have 24 individual phone calls routed. So just by creating this idea of, if we take 24 analog calls, we turn them into digital calls, we sample them down because we don't have to carry. So another piece of analog is that it carries all of the information, even the information humans can't hear. So there's a tremendous amount of waste in those two, in that analog signal. So if they take that analog signal, they filter it, they turn it into binary, and they stuff it onto this, into this 64 kilobyte channel, then all of a sudden they get a 12 times capacity. 12 times because a T1 is two pair. So for every two pair, they'd get 24 channels. And then it becomes possible, as computing advances, and we'll definitely cover this in depth, to start switching those phone calls without having to create an end-to-end copper connection, right? Because the digitization of communication, you talked to the operator, you dialed the phone, whatever you did, somehow it went into a mechanical switch, and it would move all the little pieces it would move this disk inside and connect your phone to the right next one. And then the next switch would move a physical thing around and connect. And eventually that daisy chain would get you all the way to who you're trying to talk to. With the digitization, all of a sudden it became possible to do things like get bigger and bigger and bigger circuits. It was the start of what we use today in the internet. And we'll get into the SS7 switches and T3s and when everything went to optical. But at this point, so where we're going to start now with the story of the internet is we will start at the end of World War II. So some of this we'll cover again in a little more detail. With, the back of our minds, we'll have graph theory, we'll have information theory, we'll have computing from Turing and Ada Lovelace and Babbage. And from Claude, we will get kind of the methodology that is going to be applied to allow for this digitization of the world. Okay. And that's where the next episode will pick up. Probably the first thing we'll discuss will be some of the early supercomputers. So hopefully in the next episode, I can spend some time talking about the early days of computing and getting us from the end of World War II up to the 1960s, where everything actually kicks off for the internet. I pondered spending 5 or 6 or more episodes on this, but I decided that the best thing to do was probably just sit down and talk to you guys for a couple of episodes to go through this chain of events in a very, I don't want to say hurried, but direct way to get to the main topic of conversation. If you find value in this section and you want to dive into any more, please let me know in the comments. But for the moment, my goal is simply to get us as quickly as we can to day one with some concept of the background and how it all came about. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll be at episode 3 or 4 and kicking off with the Department of Defense deciding that they needed to be able to launch nuclear weapons, even if the country was exploding, because, that's always fun. Right. So I hope this was of value. I'm sorry it wasn't quite as polished as some of my other videos. I just wanted to sit down and get all this out so we could move forward. So if you enjoyed, please subscribe, obviously, if you'd like to see more. And also, as this is kicking off a new channel and a new podcast, please forward this to people you know who might be interested. I'm very interested in building a community here of people who are both other experts and interested parties so we can exchange thoughts and ideas as this all goes along. And with that, I bid you good night. It's time for me to go shovel more snow. I will see you in the next episode. Thank you.